In early April 1979, in the closed Soviet city of Sverdlovsk, a tightly controlled industrial center east of the Ural Mountains, known on official maps only by coded designations and restricted to outsiders without special authorization, a pattern of sudden illness began to emerge among workers and residents living in narrow corridors downwind of a nondescript military compound that few civilians fully understood, and within days local hospitals were admitting men with high fevers, severe chest pain, respiratory distress, and rapidly progressing systemic failure that defied initial clinical expectations. Yet the official explanation that followed would attribute these deaths not to an airborne pathogen, but to contaminated meat, a narrative that Soviet authorities repeated with bureaucratic confidence, even as Western intelligence analysts quietly assessed that something far more alarming had occurred. The facility at the center of suspicion was Compound 19, a military microbiology installation operating under the Ministry of Defense as part of the Soviet Union's expansive biological weapons program, an effort that continued covertly despite the USSR's 1972 signature of the Biological Weapons Convention, which formally prohibited development, production, and stockpiling of biological agents for offensive purposes. In practice, however, the Soviet system had constructed an intricate network of research institutes and production plants under civilian and military cover, organized through entities such as Bioweapons and overseen by the highest levels of state authority, designed to scale laboratory research into industrial quantities of weaponized pathogens including anthrax, smallpox, and plague. On or about April 2nd, 1979, according to later reconstructions, a routine maintenance procedure at Compound 19 involved the removal of a clogged air filter from an exhaust system connected to a building where dried anthrax spores were processed for military use. And, in the course of that maintenance, the replacement filter was either not installed or not secured properly before production resumed, allowing a plume of aerosolized Bacillus anthracis spores to escape through a rooftop vent and drift southeast across adjacent neighborhoods and industrial zones in a narrow band consistent with prevailing wind conditions. The victims were not randomly distributed across the city. They fell along a corridor extending from the military facility through ceramic plants and residential blocks, a pattern that would later become central to epidemiological analysis, but at the time was obscured by official directives. Within days, individuals who had worked in factories or walked along specific streets began experiencing symptoms consistent with inhalational anthrax, the most lethal form of the disease, characterized by initial flu-like signs followed by sudden respiratory collapse and hemorrhagic mediastinitis. Autopsies conducted by local pathologists reportedly revealed severe lung pathology and mediastinal widening, yet medical records were rapidly classified, and civilian doctors were instructed to record diagnoses aligned with gastrointestinal infection linked to tainted meat. The official line presented through local party channels and state media described an outbreak of food poisoning resulting from black market livestock slaughter, and security services moved quickly to confiscate suspected meat products and arrest individuals accused of illicit trade, reinforcing the narrative that negligence among civilians rather than military activity was responsible. At the same time, the KGB imposed information controls, warning hospital staff against unauthorized discussion and monitoring communication with foreign contacts, while the city's closed status limited external observation. Western intelligence agencies, including the CIA and the British Defense Intelligence Staff, began receiving fragmentary reports through diplomatic and human sources suggesting a cluster of unexplained deaths in a restricted Soviet city with known military microbiology infrastructure, and analysts compared the symptoms described with known characteristics of weaponized anthrax, noting the concentration among adult males of working age, particularly those employed in facilities located directly downwind from Compound 19. Satellite imagery offered limited resolution, but confirmed the presence of a military installation with biosafety features consistent with large-scale fermentation and drying equipment, and signals intelligence captured references to heightened internal security measures in Sverdlovsk. Despite these indicators, definitive proof remained elusive, as Soviet authorities denied any breach and maintained that the outbreak had been contained. Inside the USSR, families of victims received limited information. Death certificates listed nonspecific causes, and burials were conducted under supervision to prevent tissue, sampling, or independent investigation. Reports later indicated that KGB officers visited relatives to discourage inquiry, and that certain scientists involved in the facility's operations were reassigned or silenced, reinforcing the culture of secrecy surrounding strategic weapons programs. The scale of the outbreak, later estimated to involve at least 66 confirmed deaths and potentially more unrecorded cases, represented one of the most significant accidental releases of a biological warfare agent in history, yet in 1979, the global community lacked access to verifiable data. The Biological Weapons Convention, only 7 years old, contained no intrusive verification mechanism, relying instead on state declarations and diplomatic trust. And the Sverdlovsk incident exposed the limitations of that framework when confronted with a closed society determined to conceal internal failure. Over subsequent years, Western epidemiologists attempted to model the event using available information, hypothesizing an airborne release based on symptom progression and geographic clustering. But without on-site access, their conclusions remained provisional. Soviet publications continued to describe the episode as foodborne anthrax linked to contaminated meat sold on the black market, a scenario plausible in rural outbreaks, but inconsistent with the narrow urban distribution observed. Within Soviet scientific circles, discussion was constrained. Researchers who might have questioned the official narrative operated under strict security classifications, and the broader biological weapons enterprise continued expanding through the 1980s, reportedly employing tens of thousands of personnel across multiple facilities. It was not until the late 1980s and early 1990s, amid the political transformations initiated by Mikhail Gorbachev's policies of glasnost and perestroika, and culminating in the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, that fragments of the truth began to surface, publicly. Defectors and former officials disclosed details of the offensive biological program, and in 1992, Russian President Boris Yeltsin acknowledged that the Sverdlovsk outbreak had resulted from a military accident rather than contaminated meat. Subsequent joint investigations by Russian and Western scientists, including on-site visits and analysis of medical records, confirmed that the pattern of fatalities aligned with an aerosol release from Compound 19, validating years of external suspicion. The episode revealed not only the existence of a vast clandestine bioweapons infrastructure, but also the extent of the Soviet cover-up apparatus, which had prioritized state secrecy over transparency even in the face of civilian deaths. The victims of Sverdlovsk were initially described as casualties of food poisoning. Only after the dissolution of the system that produced the accident did their deaths become recognized as the consequence of an industrial-scale weapons program operating in violation of international treaty commitments. The 1979 leak demonstrated the lethal intersection of secrecy, militarization, and public health in the Cold War's late decades, exposing how strategic weapons development could remain hidden behind bureaucratic narratives until geopolitical transformation forced disclosure. In the immediate aftermath of the April 1979 release, the Soviet response followed a familiar Cold War pattern in which containment of information proceeded with greater urgency than containment of the pathogen itself, and within hours of hospital admissions multiplying across the affected district, regional party officials and security organs moved to centralize control over medical data, restricting autopsy access, sealing laboratory reports, and instructing physicians to attribute deaths to intestinal anthrax contracted through consumption of contaminated meat purchased on the black market, a narrative that offered a socially acceptable explanation, while diverting scrutiny from a military installation whose existence was formally classified. The epidemiological characteristics of the outbreak, however, were inconsistent with a foodborne event. Inhalational anthrax typically presents with an incubation period of 1 to 6 days, beginning with nonspecific symptoms such as fever, malaise, and cough before progressing to severe respiratory distress. Mediastinal widening visible on radiographs, hemorrhagic lymphadenitis, and rapid systemic collapse. Gastrointestinal anthrax, by contrast, produces abdominal pain, vomiting, and bloody diarrhea, and while both forms are dangerous, their demographic and spatial distributions differ. Doctors in Sverdlovsk reportedly observed lung pathology during autopsies that suggested inhalation rather than ingestion, yet pathology slides and tissue samples were classified and, in some cases, removed by military authorities. The KGB imposed direct oversight in hospitals, warning staff against external communication and monitoring telephone lines. Families seeking clarification were told that their relatives had consumed infected meat sourced from illegal slaughterhouses, and public health campaigns were launched to confiscate suspect livestock products, reinforcing the official story. At the same time, internal military investigations sought to determine the scale of the breach at Compound 19. The facility itself was part of a larger network of production sites under the direction of the Ministry of Defense, designed to transform laboratory research on Bacillus anthracis into industrially dried spores suitable for weaponization, a process involving fermentation tanks, centrifugation, drying chambers, and milling equipment capable of producing particles optimized for aerosol dispersion. The accident reportedly occurred when a clogged exhaust filter was removed during maintenance and production resumed before replacement, allowing spores to escape through the ventilation stack. Prevailing winds that evening carried the aerosol southeast across a narrow band of the city, sparing neighborhoods outside the plume's path and producing a linear pattern of infection consistent with airborne dispersal rather than contaminated food distribution. Western intelligence agencies pieced together fragments of this scenario through diplomatic reporting and technical analysis. The CIA's Directorate of Intelligence examined the geographic clustering of deaths relative to known military facilities, while British analysts evaluated medical descriptions obtained from émigré contacts. Although satellite imagery could not detect biological agents, it confirmed the presence of industrial structures with biosafety features consistent with high containment production. Analysts compared the distribution of cases to wind data archived from meteorological stations, noting alignment between reported fatalities and prevailing southeast winds on April 2nd. Yet absent direct access to medical records or on-site inspection, these assessments remained classified hypotheses rather than public conclusions. The Soviet Union, a signatory to the 1972 Biological Weapons Convention, continued to deny offensive biological weapons development, maintaining that all research at facilities such as Compound 19 was defensive and prophylactic. The absence of a verification regime under the convention limited international recourse. Within the USSR, scientists who understood the technical realities of the program faced institutional constraints. Biopreparat, the ostensibly civilian organization overseeing much of the biological weapons enterprise, employed thousands of researchers across multiple cities, including facilities in Kirov, Zagorsk, and Koltsovo, and operated under strict secrecy protocols. Discussion of the Sverdlovsk incident outside authorized channels risked professional and legal consequences. Some reports later indicated that certain specialists quietly recognized the airborne nature of the outbreak, but were instructed to align public statements with the food contamination narrative. Burial procedures were reportedly supervised to limit the possibility of independent tissue analysis, and some bodies were interred in sealed zinc coffins. Over subsequent months, the outbreak subsided, as anthrax spores do not spread person to person, and the initial plume had dissipated quickly. But the long-term impact on affected families remained unacknowledged publicly. Internationally, suspicion persisted. The U.S. State Department raised concerns privately through diplomatic channels, and intelligence briefings informed policymakers that the most plausible explanation involved a military release. Yet without incontrovertible evidence, Washington avoided overt accusation, balancing concern with the broader strategic environment of late détente. The Sverdlovsk incident thus entered a liminal space within Cold War intelligence history, widely suspected in classified circles as an accidental bioweapons leak, yet publicly attributed to contaminated meat by Soviet authorities. Its true nature, shielded by the structural opacity of a closed city and a centralized security apparatus. Throughout the early 1980s, as the Soviet biological weapons program reportedly expanded, producing industrial-scale quantities of anthrax and exploring genetically modified strains of other pathogens, the official account of Sverdlovsk remained unchanged. The gap between treaty commitments and clandestine production underscored the limitations of arms control agreements lacking inspection mechanisms. It was only with the political transformations initiated in the late 1980s, glasnost loosening censorship, perestroika restructuring state institutions, and eventual dissolution of the Soviet Union, that insiders began disclosing the scope of the program. Former officials and scientists provided interviews confirming that Compound 19 had been engaged in offensive production, and that the 1979 outbreak had resulted from an accidental airborne release. In 1992, President Boris Yeltsin publicly acknowledged that the deaths were caused by a military facility accident, contradicting decades of official denials. Subsequent joint investigations involving Russian and Western epidemiologists analyzed hospital records and geographic data, confirming that the fatalities aligned with a narrow plume extending from the facility and affecting primarily adult males working in factories along its path. The Soviet cover-up, maintained for more than a decade, collapsed under archival scrutiny and scientific reconstruction. The victims, once described as casualties of food poisoning, were reclassified as unintended casualties of a clandestine weapons program that had operated in violation of international commitments. The Sverdlovsk leak thus became not only a public health tragedy, but a case study in Cold War secrecy, illustrating how strategic weapons, development, institutionalized denial, and information control converged to obscure a lethal accident until systemic political change rendered concealment unsustainable. As the Soviet Union moved into the late 1980s, the political reforms initiated by Mikhail Gorbachev began to loosen the rigid information controls that had protected the official Sverdlovsk narrative for nearly a decade. And it was within this environment of cautious transparency that fragments of the truth started to surface from within the very institutions that had once enforced silence. Glasnost did not immediately dismantle military secrecy, but it created limited space for investigative journalism and scientific inquiry that had previously been impossible. Local doctors and pathologists who had been constrained in 1979 found new opportunities to discuss anomalies in medical records, and some researchers began re-examining autopsy findings that had long contradicted the contaminated meat explanation. Meanwhile, Western intelligence services, which had maintained classified assessments pointing toward an airborne release, saw renewed opportunity for engagement as Soviet officials expressed willingness to cooperate on arms control confidence-building measures. The collapse of the Soviet Union in December 1991 accelerated this process. With the dissolution of centralized Communist Party authority and the fragmentation of military-industrial structures, former officials from Bioweapons and the Ministry of Defense became more willing to disclose operational details about the biological weapons enterprise. One of the most significant confirmations came in 1992, when Russian President Boris Yeltsin, who had served as Communist Party chief in Sverdlovsk during the late 1970s before rising to national leadership, publicly acknowledged that the outbreak had resulted from an accident at a military biological facility. His admission marked the first official repudiation of the contaminated meat narrative and opened the door to international scientific investigation. Subsequent joint research efforts between Russian scientists and Western epidemiologists undertook detailed reconstruction of the event. Investigators obtained access to medical records, death certificates, and burial registries that had previously been classified. By mapping the residential and occupational locations of confirmed victims against archived meteorological data from April 2, 1979, researchers identified a narrow zone of infection extending southeast from Compound 19, consistent with prevailing winds recorded that evening. The victims were overwhelmingly adult males of working age employed in factories and workshops directly downwind of the facility, including ceramic and metal plants, rather than distributed randomly across markets or households, as would be expected in a foodborne outbreak. Clinical evidence from preserved autopsy slides revealed hemorrhagic mediastinitis and pulmonary pathology, characteristic of inhalational anthrax rather than gastrointestinal infection. These findings validated long-standing suspicions within Western intelligence communities and disproved the Soviet explanation that contaminated meat had caused the deaths. Investigators estimated that at least 66 individuals died directly from the exposure, though some assessments suggested higher numbers when accounting for incomplete records and misclassified cases. The broader significance of Sverdlovsk extended beyond the local tragedy. The incident demonstrated that despite formal adherence to the 1972 Biological Weapons Convention, the Soviet Union had maintained and expanded a covert offensive biological program throughout the 1970s and 1980s. Facilities under Bioweapons and military oversight employed thousands of scientists and technicians, producing large quantities of dried anthrax spores and researching genetically modified strains of pathogens intended to enhance virulence or resistance to antibiotics. The lack of a verification mechanism within the convention allowed these activities to proceed without intrusive inspection, exposing a structural weakness in international arms control architecture. Sverdlovsk illustrated how treaty commitments could be undermined by state secrecy, and how accidental release of a strategic pathogen could result in civilian casualties within a highly controlled society. The cover-up apparatus, comprising KGB monitoring of hospitals, confiscation of tissue samples, surveillance of families, and suppression of scientific discussion, revealed the integration of security services into public health governance when strategic programs were at risk of exposure. For the families of victims, the official acknowledgement in the early 1990s came after more than a decade of enforced silence. Some sought legal redress and compensation, though the post-Soviet Russian state faced economic turmoil that limited institutional response. The burial sites, once tightly controlled, became focal points for memorialization, and independent journalists documented personal accounts from survivors and relatives who had long suspected the official explanation was incomplete. Scientists who had been reassigned or constrained in 1979 described internal investigations that identified procedural failures at Compound 19, including the improper replacement of an exhaust filter during maintenance and inadequate fail-safe mechanisms to prevent aerosol release. The accident underscored the inherent risk of scaling biological agents for weaponization, where industrial production processes amplify the potential consequences of minor technical errors. Internationally, the confirmation of the Sverdlovsk leak reinvigorated discussions about strengthening the Biological Weapons Convention through verification protocols, though negotiations over intrusive inspection measures proved complex. The episode became a case study in arms control forums, illustrating the gap between declared compliance and clandestine capability. It also reshaped historical understanding of the late Cold War, demonstrating that the superpower rivalry had extended into domains of biological engineering, with risks not fully appreciated by the public at the time. The truth about Sverdlovsk did not emerge through external detection alone. It required systemic political transformation within the state that had concealed it. The collapse of centralized authority removed barriers that had protected classified programs and enabled former insiders to speak openly about the scale and intent of the biological weapons enterprise. By the mid-1990s, the Sverdlovsk incident was recognized internationally as one of the most significant accidental releases of a weaponized pathogen in history, a stark reminder of the dangers inherent in secret strategic programs operating beyond transparent oversight. The victims, once recorded as casualties of tainted meat, were reclassified as unintended casualties of an industrial military system that had prioritized secrecy over public health. The city itself, renamed Yekaterinburg after the fall of the Soviet Union, became associated not only with its industrial heritage, but with a cautionary narrative about the intersection of weapons development, information control, and human cost. The 1979 leak demonstrated that in the closed ecosystems of Cold War military research, a single procedural lapse could expose thousands to lethal risk, and that the truth, when subordinated to state security, might remain buried until political transformation renders concealment untenable. The full historical weight of the Sverdlovsk incident only became clear when investigators were able to place it within the broader architecture of the Soviet biological weapons complex, a system that by the late 1970s had evolved into one of the largest and most secretive military scientific enterprises in the world, employing an estimated 40,000 to 60,000 personnel across dozens of research institutes, production plants, and testing facilities dispersed from European Russia to Siberia, all operating under layers of civilian cover and classified military authority. Compound 19 in Sverdlovsk was not an isolated anomaly, but one node in a network designed to transition pathogens from laboratory-scale experimentation to mass production, suitable for strategic deployment. Anthrax was considered particularly attractive for weaponization because Bacillus anthracis spores are durable, capable of surviving for decades in soil, resistant to environmental degradation, and lethal when inhaled in sufficient quantity. Industrial production required large fermentation tanks to cultivate bacterial cultures, centrifuges to concentrate them, and spray drying equipment to produce particles in the optimal 1 to 5 micron range for deep lung penetration. This process inherently increased the risk of accidental aerosolization, particularly if filtration systems failed or maintenance protocols were bypassed. The April 1979 release, later traced to a missing or improperly installed exhaust filter, illustrated how a minor procedural lapse in such a facility could generate a narrow but deadly plume. That plume, driven by wind patterns recorded by local meteorological stations, moved across a specific industrial corridor, infecting individuals who had no knowledge that a military pathogen had entered the air they were breathing. The Soviet cover-up extended beyond the immediate suppression of medical evidence. Internal communications reportedly instructed regional party officials to maintain strict adherence to the contaminated meat explanation, and epidemiological teams were directed to construct a foodborne transmission chain, even when clinical data suggested otherwise. This effort reflected an institutional imperative to protect not only the secrecy of Compound 19, but the broader strategic narrative that the Soviet Union was complying with its international treaty obligations. Public acknowledgement of an airborne release would have exposed violation of the Biological Weapons Convention and undermined diplomatic credibility at a time when détente and arms control negotiations were central components of Soviet foreign policy. The episode therefore became a collision point between strategic deception and public health reality. When Boris Yeltsin admitted in 1992 that the outbreak had been caused by a military accident, he did so in a political environment transformed by the dissolution of centralized communist authority. Yet even then, full transparency proved difficult. Access to some archival materials remained restricted, and the scale of the offensive biological program only gradually emerged through defectors and investigative reporting. Scientists such as those formerly associated with biopreparat described ongoing research during the 1980s into enhanced strains of pathogens, including attempts to increase antibiotic resistance or alter virulence characteristics, efforts that underscored how far the program had advanced beyond defensive study. The Sverdlovsk accident thus became a retrospective indicator of systemic risk within that enterprise. For arms control experts, it provided empirical evidence that without intrusive verification mechanisms, compliance with biological weapons prohibitions could not be assumed. For epidemiologists, it demonstrated how pattern analysis, mapping cases against wind trajectories and facility locations, could reconstruct concealed releases even years later. For the families of the dead, it represented a delayed recognition of what had occurred after more than a decade of official denial. The transformation of Sverdlovsk into Yekaterinburg symbolized broader political change, yet the physical landscape still bore traces of the military-industrial system that had shaped the city's Cold War identity. The facility known as Compound 19 remained part of Russia's biodefense infrastructure, reclassified and repurposed, but still associated with a history that bridged secrecy and exposure. In the wider context of Cold War history, the 1979 anthrax leak stands as one of the clearest examples of how clandestine, strategic programs could produce unintended domestic casualties while remaining hidden from international accountability. It revealed the limits of state-controlled narratives when confronted with scientific reconstruction and geopolitical transformation. The Soviet Union's initial insistence on contaminated meat as the cause of death was not merely a defensive reflex, but a calculated preservation of treaty posture and military secrecy. Only after the collapse of the system that enforced that narrative did the epidemiological and archival evidence converge to establish the truth. The Sverdlovsk incident therefore occupies a distinct place in the chronology of late Cold War events, an accidental release from an illegal weapons program concealed through coordinated information control, suspected for years by external analysts, and finally confirmed when political change dismantled the barriers to disclosure. It demonstrated that biological weapons development, conducted behind closed borders and shielded by national security doctrine, carries inherent risks that extend beyond adversaries to the population it claims to protect, and that in the architecture of secrecy that defined much of the Cold War, the most consequential truths could remain suppressed until the very structures that hid them ceased to exist.